Good morning. My name is Judd Devermont. I'm the director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic International Studies, and I want to welcome you to our event, Digital Solutions to COVID-19 and Urban Challenges in Sub-Saharan Africa. I couldn't be more excited to have this conversation today. We're really going to touch on two themes that have been central to the Africa program's research agenda, and one topic that has been, well, central to our lives in mid-2020. Obviously, we're talking about urbanization, technology, and COVID-19. And I want to spend just a brief moment or two talking about these three elements, and then I'll introduce our speakers and the conversation will commence. But first, let's just talk quickly about urbanization. The Africa program believes strongly that this is the most important transformation in sub-Saharan Africa in the 21st century. The population right now, urban population, is about 40%. It will be 50% by the end of the decade. And it is my view that many donors are still underweighted when it comes to investing in urban governance, when it comes to thinking through urban development challenges and looking for opportunities in the urban sector. Then we're going to talk about technology. Again, another thing that CSIS Africa program has been focused on. It's a contrast to the urbanization story where there is breathless reporting about how technology can transform the continent, how there could be leapfrogging. And the challenge here is to identify which technologies and investments can be transformative and which of those are maybe more nuanced or limited. And it's been really gratifying that over the last couple of years, the US government and other donors have elevated investments in technology as a central focus for programs and for assisting US and other international companies. And then finally, COVID-19. As of today, there has been 95,000 cases, confirmed cases in Africa, and 2,995 deaths. Clearly, we all are thinking a lot about COVID-19, about how this will change the region's economies, its health systems, and its foreign relations. But what's interesting about the disease and why it's useful to have this conversation today is that we're learning a lot about African societies in the way in which the trajectory of the virus has unfolded. It's primarily been, although I think some of this has to do with limited testing, an urban challenge. And what we've also seen is that technology has been one way in which Africans can weather this crisis, whether it's in terms of education or it's in terms of moving money to get services or to family members, or just the ability to work virtually. So I'm excited that today's conversation is going to bring all of these three things together, and we couldn't have better speakers. In fact, in the pre-call, there was such a great, just a great rapport with everyone. I don't know how we're going to stay in just within the hour time frame that we have. But let me introduce our speakers. First, Max Cuvier. He is the head of the Mobile for Development M4D at GSMA. M4D is positioned at the intersection of the mobile ecosystem and the development sector to drive innovation in digital technology to reduce inequalities in the world. Max joined GSMA in 2012 and held positions with various programs. He first was involved with mobile operators and partners to design solutions to ensure women in emerging markets don't get left out of the digital economy. He later was involved in the Ecosystem Accelerator and the M4D Utilities Program, which has allocated a combined $22 million in grants funding to 85 ventures in 40 plus countries across Africa and Asia. We have Astrid Haas. She is the political director of the International Growth Center, or IGC. Astrid was previously the senior country economist for cities and the head of Cities That Work initiative at IGC. Her current research specializes in the area of municipal and infrastructure finance in particular, but she's also worked in other areas such as urban mobility and urban land tenure. She works with various mayors, city managers, and teams in Africa and Asia to support research and evidence-based policy reform. In this capacity, ASERT has been invited to provide peer review of a new municipal law of Afghanistan by the acting mayor of Kabul, to chair the Hargeisa Municipal Finance Reform Task Force by the Minister of Interior in Somaliland, as well as help the research program within the Kampala Capital City Authority. And she joins us from Uganda. And finally, Worku Gachu is the managing director for Africa at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, also known as DFC. We all have lots of acronyms here, which is America's development bank. As a managing director, Worku serves as the key advisor to the agency's chief executive officer, providing guidance and leadership on policy and transactional matters in Sub-Saharan Africa. The DFC's Africa portfolio consists of $5.3 billion in 145 projects across the continent. He previously served in the same capacity for the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, before it became DFC. Before joining the agency, Worku was a policy advisor at Covington Burlington's Public Policy and Government Affairs practice. And before that, he led the Africa portfolio for the Committee on Foreign Affairs at the House of Representatives. So with that incredibly impressive group of people, I know that we're going to have a great conversation, and I'm going to hand it over to Max to set the baseline for our discussion. Max?
Yeah, thank you very much, Judd, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can see the presentation and we don't have any technical issues here. So thank you very much for this opportunity. The objective of the presentation, which I will keep short, is to, as you were framing, look at the potential of digital solutions to address African cities' challenges with a focus on the urban poor and in particular why it matters, particularly in the current COVID-19 context. So just to begin very quickly, who we are. So Mobile for Development is a department of the GSMA, which is the trade association of the mobile industry. And we focus on realizing the potential of digital innovation in terms of socioeconomic impact. What we do is we bring together the public and the private sector, as we believe that basically looking at commercially sustainable solutions is the way to scale and therefore to impact. And we support the ecosystem through the usual mechanisms of technical assistance, research, advocacy, but also by de-risking small projects. So in short, why do African cities matter, in particular in the current COVID-19 context? Well, as you said, Judd, a large percentage of the population now lives in cities, and 90% of the world's urban population growth between now and 2050 is expected to happen in Africa and Asia. And urbanization is already well underway. If we look at Africa Poli's numbers, it could mean that another billion urban dwellers will be joining Africa's cities by 2050. And as you can see on the map on the left, this is not just a reality for existing large cities that are on the radar, like a Lagos or a Kinshasa, but is also the case for smaller, quote unquote, smaller secondary cities that are not always on the radar, such as Onitsha in Nigeria or Mbujimayi in DRC. What the graph on the right shows you is a good reminder that contexts differ per country. We know we don't talk about Africa as a unity, but it's even more real when you look at cities. Specifically, if there's usually a very good correlation between GDP growth and urbanization in Asia, it's not always the case for all African countries, as you can see on the graph. So why do what are the challenges that are faced here? There's obviously a growing middle class across Africa and in African cities in particular, but I just want to focus here on what we call the urban poor, for lack of a better word, as most of the urban growth is actually happening across Africa, driven by the expansion of informal settlements, where the majority of the urban population still lives today. In those settlements, the reality is that unreliable and unaffordable basic services are often the rule. Regarding COVID-19 specifically, in this type of environments, concepts like social distancing or confinement are not always suitable to these areas. So there are plenty of examples of like a variety of services that are suboptimal to the urban poor. But just to cite a couple, and the couple of examples will come from Nigeria. Access to power In Nigeria alone, there's an estimated 22 million small gasoline generators deployed today in cities to power households and small businesses and basically address the failures of the traditional power grid. If you look at access to water, outside of Nigeria, there are 11 countries across Sub-Saharan Africa with access to basic water services for the urban poor. If you look at the lowest quintile of the urban population, is actually decreasing. And going back to Nigeria and Lagos, the private water tanker fleet has quadrupled in the past 10 years. And if you relate this back to COVID-19, how do you enforce even the most basic hygiene rules when you have tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, of urban dwellers who do not have access to safely manage water and to soap in their homes? And one last point here, and that's quite important, is that inequalities in access are often exacerbated by asymmetric government support. For instance, local governments, they will tend to prioritize those that already have access to pipe water or to sewage networks, which is not the case of most of the urban poor. So what kind of solution digital, quote unquote, can bring in this context? And I mean, digital solutions are uniquely placed to help address some of these challenges. If you look at the penetration of mobile services in particular, mobile connectivity and mobile payments have a large reach and can help make basic services more accessible and affordable. You've got 181 million citizens across Sub-Saharan Africa that are actively using mobile money. And this was a number by the end of 2019, which has likely grown in the current context. Mobile internet penetration overall is still low, around 30%, but cities are way ahead of rural areas. So the foundations are basically here for a lot of innovations to happen. You see a couple examples on the slide, but pay-as-you-go models, for instance, make large assets accessible to the urban poor by breaking down the cost into multiple micropayments. Or smart metering can help solve the problem of non-revenue water that cripples most of the water utility providers, while allowing users the ability to pay for what they actually consume. And finally, if you look at big data, it can help inform policymaking, whether in the context of a crisis by identifying clusters of COVID-19 patients, for instance, but more generally to help with infrastructure decisions like where to build the next bridge or where to build the next hospital. I will finish very soon, but I want to finish by saying that these are not theoretical applications of mobile technology. There are a lot of players in the ecosystem, in particular SMEs and startups, that are currently working on such solutions. And we're very proud at M4D and GSMA to have supported a lot of them. Again, here I'm just going to mention two. You see on the slide CityTaps. They developed a smart prepaid meter for urban household that's been deployed in Niamey in Niger and is now being replicated across multiple markets in Africa. In the current context of the pandemic, they can allow, for instance, the government to easily make some water connections free and charge for others, all of this with the flip of a switch. And at the same time, having smart meters reduce the need for in-person meter reading, where that can carry a risk in a world where we try and distance ourselves. The other example that I want to call out is Koriba in Côte d'Ivoire. They've developed a mobile-supported plastic recycling solution that connects households and businesses with trained plastic waste pickers, and then basically uses this plastic waste to convert it into pellets in their factory in Abidjan. Both of these companies, and it's quite at the core of what we do, have partnered with local mobile operators, Orange and MTN respectively, and have also been supported by our program, not only in terms of technical assistance, but also in terms of de-risking capital, which is provided by the Department for International Development in the UK. So as I promised, I will keep it short. I will stop here, and I realize that it was short, but you can find more information in our report on digital solutions for the urban poor. For anything related to urbanization, I strongly recommend it. The team did a really good job at packaging all our learnings into something that's very straightforward. And also on our website, gsma.com/COVIDM4D, where we look at updates and guidance on the digital response to COVID-19, in particular in developing markets. So I'll stop here.
Great, thank you, Max. And I would say that the report is phenomenal. That's why we're having the event. I read the report and reached out to GSMA because I thought the findings were particularly useful in this day and age. We're going to do a moderated Q&A right now, and then we will move to audience questions. It's really easy to submit a question. Just go to the event page, and there's a link, and then we'll be able to read off a couple of questions towards the end of our event. But first, I want to start with Astrid, because I think one of the challenges with urbanization has been this urbanization without growth. And Max mentioned the potential to really address some of these challenges, and I assume we're going to have a very bullish conversation about the opportunities for technology. But this is our one chance to set the stage a little bit and to add a little realism. So, given all of your experiences working in urban environments, what are some of the structural impediments when it comes to growth, economic growth, and then also municipal government?
Thanks, Judd. So let me sort of take Max's presentation and his graph where he showed the correlations between urbanization and growth. And he mentioned that, in Asia, it's positively correlated. And if you were to draw those graphs for Europe and the US, they would be positively correlated too. No country has yet developed without urbanizing, and that is where the opportunity for Africa lies. However, the big structural impediment is that Africa is urbanizing without industrializing. And this has a major effect on how productive cities are, but also how cities can support overall national growth. And this manifests itself with the lack of a manufacturing sector, essentially, in a city, which means that there are not enough jobs for people who come to cities. So people who come from rural areas looking for jobs in cities, there are not enough jobs. And those are the ones who become the urban poor, again, sort of harking back to Max's presentation. And to be able to really eke out a livelihood in the city, they then operate in the informal sector. And so just to give you a sense of what that looks like from my own city, Kampala, where I'm talking from, pre-COVID, so in 2016, the World Bank did a full census of the informal sector here in Kampala. And 82% of informal sector firms were actually working in services, mostly non-tradable. So for example, providing haircuts or selling goods, selling food. And I think this is sort of well illustrated by the fact that 59.3% of these firms were only single employees. So it's just one person entrepreneurial businesses, not providing jobs for anyone else and not growing beyond that one person. And the structural sort of impediment that provides is that they have very low turnover. So 69% of these firms were having an annual turnover of $2,600 or less, right? So given they're in the informal sector, they're not in the tax base anyway yet. But even if they were in the tax base, the amount that the city government could raise in terms of taxes from them would be negligible compared to the infrastructure and the service challenges that Max alluded to in his presentation and that are further illustrated in the report. And I think just to end on the relevance for a COVID-19 time, and this is where IGC has been doing a lot of its work, is to sort of look at the economic impacts of this crisis, is that at the time of that census in 2016, 93% of informal sector firms were operating on or close to the poverty line. Now, in Uganda, we have gone to a full lockdown since the 1st of April. And since the 1st of April, the majority of these firms have not been able to operate. And since they are mostly one-person businesses, mostly living on a day-to-day wage, and using a large part of that wage to purchase food, because urban areas are not a very practical place to grow one's own food, it means that this is what's impacting hunger. And simulations done by my colleagues at the IGC, just to sort of show the magnitude of this impact, have predicted that across Africa, an 8-week lockdown has probably pushed 168 million people to not be able to meet their pre-COVID consumption patterns. And as lockdowns continue, and as we think about how the world will look like in a post-COVID world with slower economy, these are the major impacts that it will have on cities.
Thanks, Astrid. And I want to get back to some of the impacts of COVID-19 on the economy with you in just a bit, but let me turn to Worku, because when DFC was still OPIC in 2018, you launched the Connect Africa initiative, and really the focus matches a lot of the things that Max is talking about. And I hope that you could talk a little bit about what that program is, where our the overlap between what we're talking about today in terms of technology in the urban sector. And then Max had a number of different sort of like categories of ways in which digital technology can be impactful, whether it was pay as you go or big data or Internet of Things. And maybe if any of the programs that you're looking at has some of those elements, I think that would be really interesting.
Great. Thanks, Judd, and thanks for organizing this discussion this morning. And it's great to join Max and Astrid. And like you mentioned at the start, I'm with the Development Finance Corporation, which is the U.S. government's development bank. And so we provide a range of financial products to help stimulate economic growth in frontier and emerging markets. And so, the products we provide range from debt, equity financing, political risk insurance, and guarantees, and also act as a fund of funds. And so when you were reading my bio, it reminded me that I got to reach out to our press team, because our exposure on the continent has actually increased now to about $7 billion. So it's an exciting growth trend, and I think we see more potential for increased investments on the continent as we transform, or as we've transformed into the DFC. Specifically on the Connect Africa initiative, we committed almost now 2 years ago, $1 billion to advance three main pillars, three main sectors on the continent: value-added manufacturing, transport, and logistics. And the third pillar is the ICT. And for us, it is a recognition that meeting the challenges of the future will require connectivity. And so, how can we strategically utilize our tools to advance connectivity on the continent? All of us know about the huge development benefits, the health benefits, the education benefits when we know people are connected or online. And so, we've addressed this through kind of different facets. And the first, which I think is important and lays out kind of some of the framework for the things Max talked about, is ensuring that the countries and the kinds in which we're active in has a reliable connectivity and ICT backbone. And so we support that by financing mobile network operators, by financing fiber companies, and by financing data centers. And so, an example of our support to mobile network operators is AfriCell, a mobile network operator that's active in Sierra Leone, Gambia, Eastern Congo, and Uganda. And our financing to AfriCell went to ensure that their customers have reliable, affordable connectivity. We're looking at a number of data centers on the continent because, it was clear in our discussions with over-the-top providers from the US and from Europe that, these data centers and their proximity to their customers increases latency, which allows for increased downloads and higher consumption of data. And so, we want to ensure that the foundations for this connectivity growth are there and stable. Now, when you look at specific projects that utilize this connectivity, we've supported a number of them. I think in looking at Max's chart, one of those items that you mentioned that I think sticks out is pay as you go. And pay as you go has been utilized a lot in off-grid solar and energy space, but we're seeing it utilized in super innovative new companies. And for example, one is called Tugende in Uganda, and I'm curious if Astrid has used them to get around. That's one of my most exciting deals on the continent right now. We provided $5 million to Tugende, which is a lease-to-own boda company, and what they do is they essentially provide financing for boda drivers to eventually own their bodas and increase their capital. And those payments are from pay-as-you-go models. And interestingly enough, using pay-as-you-go, you can see the creditworthiness of those customers. And we've seen a lot of add-on services like computers, like schools, health benefits. And so I think the pay-as-you-go model is something that we've seen a lot of our current clientele and also our pipeline of transactions utilize. Another one, and it was great to see in Max's slide as well, is Twiga. Twiga is a company that helps address inefficiencies within the agriculture supply chain. And so, for us, our support to Twiga ensures that, smallholder farmers has a distribution network that allows their products and goods to get from their farms to urban vendors in a safe, reliable, and affordable manner. And so it's those type of innovative technologies that are trying to bridge a marketplace and utilize technologies to advance growth that excites us. I think one of the big takeaways for me from Max's report, and I hope he touches on a bit too, that I was surprised about was the credit worthiness of some of these cities. For us, when we look through our investments, right, especially in the utilities and services sector like water and sanitation, right, the off takers of those services are the cities. And so if their creditworthiness is in question, this makes those deals and their bankability quite difficult, right? And so I'm now thinking through, how can we look at supporting these utilities when the economic situations of those cities aren't that strong. Those are some of the major highlights. Happy to delve in and unpack any specific points that you think's worth it.
Thanks, Worku. I'm going to shift to Astrid, but maybe Max, since Worku did mention about city credit worthiness, and I'm curious myself, do you have any sort of quick answer? I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I was just saying that the reality of the value of some of the solutions that I mentioned, in particular on smart meters, I would say that is usually more relevant in cities, even though it also applies to rural areas on the energy side, is that it helps urban utilities and which are usually linked to local authorities to improve their credit worthiness. Like, think of, if you look at the amount of non-revenue water that an average water utility in an African city has to deal with, it's one of the issues that can help them get better on that front.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. All right, Astrid, the most important question: have you heard of Takede, the company that Worku mentioned? And then, maybe more important for our conversation and in honesty, is that I wanted to kind of get into this question about the impact of the lockdowns and in some of the work from your organization. You've talked about this idea of smart containment with active learning, and so I'm curious about how do you apply that when it comes to digital technology and thinking about sort of the COVID-19 challenges?
So to your first question, Worku, yes, as an avid boda writer in a non-lockdown space, I have definitely come across Takede. And obviously many other in the growing sort of ecosystem of transportation provision that is relying on digital services in Kampala. So that's very exciting.
That's great to hear.
Yes. To your question, Judd, on smart containment and active learning, I think here the sort of background to this is that, depending on what estimates that you use or the estimates that you hear, we're still relatively far away from having a vaccine for COVID, and then a vaccine that is going to be distributed across the world and ensure that we can sort of maybe pick up a pre-COVID type of lifestyle. At the same time, it is increasingly clear that we economically can't afford the costs, particularly as what I mentioned before in terms of questions of food security and hunger of total lockdowns. So the idea of smart containment is really to move away from this binary choice or this binary curse of, do we do total lockdowns and risk livelihoods, or do we open up totally and risk spread? To really sort of pushing the thinking towards a more flexible, tailored, and localized approach. And to be able to really say, okay, we're going to focus on this area and lock it down because the data is telling us that the risk profile or the health profile is such that we really need to lock it down. But also that we will open up this area as soon as the data tells us that the risk profile and the health profile means that it's ready to open up again. by having a more localized approach, it's more economically feasible and less operationally costly, obviously, to implement, because it also means that the rest of the country can still, the rest of the economy can still keep going. But what you need, and the key foundation to sort of a smart containment policy, is data. And obviously data is important in understanding a number of things. But I think both in terms of cities in Africa that are so rapidly urbanizing and rapidly changing, but more broadly right now in the COVID times where we do need a much better understanding at a much quicker pace about what the profiles are looking like, I do think one of the most powerful sources of data we have are from the telecommunications. Now, Max mentioned that, you know, mobile penetration rates are maybe less across the continent, but he did also say that they are much, much better in cities themselves. And so in a situation where, you know, maybe the last census was 10 years ago, and you want to understand who those invisible people are, the people I mentioned, the people who prior to the crisis were working just above the poverty line, but may now have been pushed into poverty with the lockdown measures, and you want to target them with social protection measures, with transfers, with other pieces. Mobile phone technology can help you do that, and there's a lot of research and work going on about the sort of machine learning you can take from people's data usage, even just how many mobile phone calls they're making, to indicate when they're sort of receiving a tail off in terms of their poverty. And so I think what's really important is that it requires data access. And I think across the board, including myself in terms of being a researcher, it's difficult to access mobile phone data, of course, because, you know, there are privacy concerns around that, and that those do need to be managed. But I think it is critically important in a phase where we need to be making rapid decisions based on very rapidly changing conditions, and where we do need to do active learning, where we can change our decisions based on new data, that we work together with mobile phone operators and others to be able to access and learn, and then act upon the policy challenges, particularly over the next coming months.
Max, Astrid put so much good thoughts onto the table that I'm going to ask you to try to help us think through. But, you know, in your presentation, in Astrid's comments, like we hear it's clear that there are technologies that could be helpful, right? That can help with water sanitation, that can help with technology around transportation, so it's sanitary. And then, you know, you even mentioned in the beginning the way that big data may be able to help us identify clusters of COVID patients. So your thoughts on, you know, how this technology can help in the COVID-19 response. I'd love you to address Astrid's point about access issues, and how are your members thinking about access issues, particularly in this crisis. And then something provocative, this is a lot I'm putting on your plate, but is there a potential that we could actually see a much wider adoption of digital technologies because of COVID-19? I've seen a lot of providers like MTN lower the waive fees for just setting up an account for mobile money, or lowering the fees for transferring. So what is your sort of, how do we respond to COVID-19 now? And could this actually change the landscape in terms of digital technology usage and adoption?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll try and split it in two, and first address your question, but also Astrid's question. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of appetite from a lot of players to access mobile operator data. I mean, CDRs or whatever you call them, that basically give you an idea of where people are, how they transact, and could actually be very helpful in modeling how the pandemic is evolving and so on. There are a lot of rules around what you can and cannot do with that data that are different from every single country. But the general rule is that mobile operators are regulated locally and have to adhere to local legislation in terms of what can be done with the data. And depending on the market, it usually means that the data cannot physically leave the country. It sometimes means that the data cannot physically leave the premises of the mobile operator. So I think here is more that there are different things that you can do. Obviously, you can talk about relaxing these rules during the pandemic, but then like you need to be extremely careful that what you do with this data and what safeguards you keep Another way, but it's more of a mid to long-term approach, is building the capacity of mobile operators, so they know how to analyze this data and can work with authorities to give them kind of an anonymized macro level view that can help them take decision. One point here is we're working in quite a few countries. We're making quite good progress in DRC in particular, but these dialogues are not usual. And even bringing the private sector, public sector to the table to make sure that the right data is produced to help authorities take decision takes quite a bit of time. More broadly on how mobile technology can be used to address COVID-19 on the health side directly. There's obviously like the usage that you can think of, like telemedicine, that can be extremely helpful to do triage, to avoid anyone with symptoms to go to their GPs or to go to the hospital to have this first stage. Though I would say that from our point of view, it's far less developed still across Africa than it is in other geographies like emerging Asia, for instance. But as you rightly pointed out, the impact of COVID-19 goes way beyond health, and the contribution of mobile technology also is critical in a lot of other areas. There's been a lot done around prevention campaign through communication and so on, but if I had to zoom in on one, I would probably look at the digitization of payments, because there are a lot of different aspects in which it can actually help slow the progression of the epidemic, but also reduce the impact on citizens. One thing is it can be healthier as it reduces the circulation of cash, which might be a factor of transmission of the disease. But it also, and probably more importantly, adds a lot of fluidity into the economy. If you look at two examples in particular, we know that a lot of citizens across Africa rely on remittances, and having the possibility to receive these remittances directly from the countries where they come from can actually be a very good way to unlock additional income and additional resources in the short term. Orange has made that available from France to Morocco, I think yesterday or the day before, and a lot of these corridors are going to be digitalized I expect in the coming days or weeks. Another point is social protection, something that Astrid did mention, and G2P payments. And it's another area where a lot has happened over the year, but we're often stuck at like discussion level, trial levels. And sorry, I'm going to mention Orange again, but they announced last week that they're working with the government in Côte d'Ivoire and are now releasing emergency funds to 180,000 households in Côte d'Ivoire. Things that probably would have taken much longer in a normal environment are being fast-tracked in a COVID environment. And that's where I get to the second part of your question. In my opinion, the current crisis could really fuel adoption, but also increase usage. It's not just the number of people who have access, but it's how much and how they use. G2P payments is a really good example. I guess you've heard of Novici in Togo. Barely a week after the launch of this social protection program relying on digital payments, there's more than 1 million people who have registered, and 450,000 of them have received their first payment through mobile money. This is the kind of scale that does not happen in a quote-unquote normal environment. And more broadly, if you look at even peer-to-peer payments, there were numbers shared last week or earlier this week about Rwanda, where they saw fourfold in value since the lockdown is enforced. So mobile payments, but also mobile internet as a tool to access health, education, business opportunities are very much likely to grow. We'll finish with a word of caution. We need to make sure we don't compromise on end user protection and privacy, which is the point that I made at the beginning. We'll have to make sure that we keep the momentum that we have, in particular in terms of the dialogue between the public and private sector partners, and ensure that the growth, anywhere it is inclusive of populations who would usually be left behind. But in my opinion, the potential is definitely there.
Thanks, Max. That's a really helpful answer and a good word of warning at the end. Worku, I want to give you the last question before we go to the audience, and that's about some of the DFC's prioritization around COVID-19. They made a big announcement that they were going to look at these sorts of investments. And so I'd like to hear a little bit about that, but then I guess more broadly, what's the pitch to American companies during COVID-19 that it still is the right time to invest in Africa? What is the sort of level of enthusiasm that you're getting or interest, and what do you tell companies to get them over the the tipping point to get involved in the African market?
Thanks, Judd. On the COVID question, I think we recognize more than ever that the development finance community and the DFC has a significant role to play in rebounding from the economic challenges that are faced because of COVID. And so, in coordinating with our DFI partners in Europe and the IFC, we focus on a few measures. First and foremost is our existing client base, recognizing that a lot of their revenues are severely hurt. Ensuring that their debt service payments to us isn't a burden. So, an example is a taxi leasing company. People aren't taking taxis, and so we are deferring their principal payments for several months. An off-grid solar investment that we've made, their clients aren't earning revenues, and so ensuring that our burdens aren't in a way affecting the survivability of their business. And so that is an important step that we're taking, and our portfolio management team is doing a great job in checking in on our nearly 200 different clients that we have on the continent right now. With COVID specifically, we were in the midst prior to this pandemic, about to launch our Health for Prosperity initiative. And this is an attempt, kind of like our Connect Africa initiative, recognizing that we need strategic, calibrated approaches to targeted investments in these important sectors, and healthcare being one of them. And so our Health and Prosperity initiative seeks to mobilize $5 billion of investment globally. We've committed $2 billion of our own capital for this effort. And what's important to remember about our investments is, we mobilize the private sector to operate in these emerging markets. So there's sustainability, right? And we're putting also private sector capital at play. And what's exciting about this proposal is that, we're looking at the entire healthcare value chain, right? So looking at therapeutics, looking at supply chain and manufacturing of PPEs and other goods on the continent, also looking at therapeutics. And so, we've taken a very strategic approach with our embassies on the continent right now, even though many of them are scaled down at a skeleton staff, where, we had an activity about a few weeks ago where each of the embassies had to essentially collate a list of companies within their respective country that could fit under this proposal, identify them, and send them back to us for our vetting for potential financing. And so this level of kind of proactive outreach and engagement is something that is new and exciting with the DFC.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Worku. We have a tremendous amount of really interesting questions for our panelists. So, Astrid, I'm going to give you the first couple of questions. The first one is from Mulugeta Katima from Cogent International Solutions. And it is that since many of Africa's workforce uses public transportation, how can digital technologies help with congested public transportation systems? And then by name, a second question from Emmanuel Osayande of Harvard University, which is, how do we overcome some of the obstacles to sourcing accurate local data about COVID infection rates? So I'll let you chew on those.
Great. So thanks for both those questions. So I think the first question sort of epitomizes the challenge with lockdowns, right? Because public transport isn't moving. It means that people find it much more difficult to move, which inhibits the power of cities, which are really sort of based on connectivity. I think there's a couple of answers that one, and I'm going to sort of focus on three. So I think one, it can help us understand the extent of the problem and where the problem is. So there's been some great work done using cell phone data in Uganda to just map out the congestion and the times. So the times people are moving, how they are moving, and what's sort of where the congestion and the bottleneck points are. That's really important information for policymakers who have a limited number of resources and want to prioritize infrastructure investments, is to understand where those need to be made, where are the bottlenecks. The Kampala Capital City Authority, so the city authority in my own city, are now in a post-COVID world looking to use digital technologies to help regularize the transport system. So a lot of the public transport that you're probably referring to is in the informal sector and doesn't necessarily follow a regular route. So the bodas that Worko was mentioning, but also the 14-seaters or in any, wherever the similar type of transport mode is in other African cities. And so they want to use platforms like Uber, SafeBoda, and others to have registered people who are providing these transport, and then using that data to help then assign and distribute routes. But again, it's about knowing people. And I think the third one is knowing the individuals and what their transport patterns are. And again, here, there has been some attempts to use mobile phone technology. So you can see with, how when someone is moving, where they're moving to in the city, how they're commuting, where they live, and therefore where they work. But a word of caution on this is that in a survey that I did with some colleagues, where we were sort of ground truthing some of this data, it's important to note that you capture only the people who move. But if you remember from my sort of previous comment, 59.3% are one-person businesses, often doing retail from probably their own home, and they're not moving. And so they're invisible in that data. So if they don't move. So there's opportunities and there's constraints as well in using particularly mobile phone data in terms of transportation. On the question of testing, caveating my answer that I am not an epidemiologist, I'm an economist. So, take that with a grain of salt, or to what you think it's worth. But I think the first and foremost problem is just limited test equipment and the testing capacity. I think we would need to be testing a lot more. But I think the second part of the answer, and I do think this is where economists do have a role to play as well, is how you deploy that limited testing equipment. And I think one of the challenges at the moment across the continent is that, and probably even across the world, is that a lot of the testing equipment is being deployed on people who are already symptomatic and who are showing symptoms. And there's a good chance that they already have COVID. And even if they're showing symptoms, they should be isolated. There is no other, there's no other choice that probably would be made with the test results. Yet one of the powerful things about this pandemic is that most people who carry it are asymptomatic, and those are the ones who are transmitting it. And so what I think from an economist's perspective, it's about how you deploy the limited use of testing equipment to randomly sample across the population, even people, just across people, symptomatic or not symptomatic, just randomly drawn from the population, to be able to give you an accurate picture of what actually the infection rates look like.
Thanks, Astrid. And I feel like for the last 3 months, I've had to use that same caveat in almost every single event that we do that we're not epidemiologists. But there are very smart public health experts at CSIS. So I hope that you're consuming the analysis they're putting out as well. Worko, let me go back to you. You got a question from Eric Hersman of BRIC. Asking, I think, a zoom out question around Connect Africa's funding and where it's been put to work. If you could just elaborate, I know you kind of addressed some of this in your opening remarks.
For sure. And, love the work that Eric and BRIC are doing in Kenya and providing connectivity, creative solutions on the connectivity front. With Connect Africa specifically, right, we had a $1 billion commitment so far. We're about $400 million of committed capital out of that $1 billion. It's tough to actually pinpoint kind of where that kind of country exposure of that money is, because a lot of the clients that we've supported with that funding actually are regional in nature, right? So when you think of Africell, right, it's a mobile network operator that's operating in 4 or 5 different countries. Some of the data centers that we have in our pipeline of transactions, right, those are regionally oriented and regionally focused. Same thing with some of the sea cables and fiber with their different branching and landing points for a number of countries. And I think, what we see, because through that is that, a lot of these large operators and ICT providers recognizing that, the investments that the amount of money it costs to make these investments in these markets are significant, right? And so looking at the continent regionally, right, makes the transaction a bit more attractive, makes it much sustainable in the costs, but then also recognizing that you are targeting a greater population, which increases your usability also. So it's a trend that I've recognized that I think is particularly exciting.
Thanks, Riku. For our last question, I'm going to go to Max to end both respond to this question, but if there's any sort of parting shots you want to add to our conversation, which is I'm going to put together a couple of questions. So there was a question around privacy, and I think you've adequately touched on that, but if there are any things that you want to expand on around, how do you address privacy issues? But there was another question that I thought was interesting around sort of the logistical challenges of implementing these digital solutions, particularly in the COVID-19 era where everyone's largely staying at home. And so maybe if you have a couple of thoughts there, but again, with just a couple minutes left to spare, any sort of zoom out views on how we should think about your report and the future of digital technology for development.
Good. That's a big task. I'm not surprised the questions on privacy keep coming back, and I think it's important to any of us as citizens to keep this at the back of our head every time we look at new initiatives and so on. I think at a macro level, I touched on this already. In my opinion, the safeguards are here, and the holders of the data just need to comply. And mobile operators who are again locally regulated certainly comply. Regulation can obviously always be better, and we're working on this as well through capacity building and so on. But I just wanted to add that a lot of the data can sometimes actually be volunteered by the users themselves. And this is why I say that privacy should remain top of mind for us as citizens. It can be, in certain cases, acceptable to decide to share your data. And I think you do it in the US, I do it here in the UK, people do it in Uganda. We share some of our data to build our credit rating, for instance, and because we see a value in it. But again, the right rules need to be there. It needs to be transparent, what kind of data we're sharing, for how long, what benefits we're getting. The rules need to be clear, basically. And the right level of customer education needs to happen as well, which is probably even more true of the urban poor or population with who are less used to understand this kind of sometimes a bit complex and unclear environment. They should really not be unclear. We've been working on this for a while at GSMA and have quite a lot of guidelines around ethics, around data privacy. You could extend it to child protection online and so on. So it's definitely top of mind for us. On the second point on how do you implement, I'm almost tempted to say that you don't roll out new infrastructure in the time of crisis. You leverage the infrastructure you have, and as I said, we're close to 200 million mobile money accounts. There are hundreds of millions of people connected to mobile and connected to the internet on Sub-Saharan Africa, and at the moment, there's a lot to be leveraged here. But a time of crisis also makes you see what are the holes in the racket, if I may, and just helps you probably make a stronger case to build up the infrastructure that's missing and make sure that in a lot of cases, the infrastructure is actually out there. You'd be surprised if you look at the numbers, but there are nearly 5 times as many people who are covered by a 3G or 4G network today and not using mobile internet than the people who are actually not covered. There are 750 million people who are not covered by mobile internet today, but close to 3.5 billion, I hope my math was right, who actually are covered but not using. So, and again, you're not going to fix this during the crisis. I think there's a lot where you can convince people of the importance of going online, of the importance of joining in the digital economy and the digital society, but you don't fix infrastructure problems in a time of crisis. And if I wanted to finish on a note, I was just I mean the potential really is there. I mean the probably 5-6 years ago it was still at a very early stage, like trying ideas and so on. But we've seen a few good examples of massive uptake and a boom in a matter of 10 years. If you look at pay-as-you-go solar home systems, they didn't exist 10 years ago. And now, like, tens of millions of households have access. If you look at, just to finish on mobile payments, it started in East Africa and a couple other countries in 2007, 2008, and so on. At the end of 2019, we crossed 1 billion registered accounts. So there is potential for massive growth, massive access, and all the positive socioeconomic benefits that are attached to it, as long as you have the right safeguards. And I'm positive that not all of this might be here during a time of crisis, but there will be a phase of recovery and a phase of preparedness where we're gonna see a massive uptake and a lot of new use cases that are going to benefit a lot of people who can really use this technology and these services.
Thanks, Max. I think that's a great way to end it. We do a lot of events at CSIS, and there's a rare few that I think to myself, I'm going to have to rewatch this myself just to get all of the insights down. The good news for our audience is this is going to be archived on the CSIS website and YouTube, so you can do the same. You can rewatch this. But let me thank Max and Astrid and Werku for joining us today for this really important conversation. And to those of you watching from home, or from your mobile device, to be on brand here, we have a bunch of events coming up on June 11th that I think will both touch on all of the issues that we talked about. On June 11th will be our 4th CSIS Africa debate, and it will be, I asked her, this is going to be right in your wheelhouse, lockdowns versus livelihoods. So I think it's going to be a really good debate, and I welcome everyone to join us. And then on that same day, on June 11th, we'll release another of our Into Africa podcasts, where we'll continue to do a deep dive on this topic we'll have a representative from GSMA there as well. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we look forward to engaging with you next. Take care.